In this presentation, we'll be discussing instrument classifications and families. Throughout this course, we'll be referring to subsections of the European orchestra in order to focus our study. Many of us might already be familiar with the typical divisions of the orchestra into families or sections of instruments, which are practical and idiomatic divisions of the orchestra. This includes dividing it down into strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, and other auxiliary instruments, including the piano, harp, and celeste. It's useful to also understand instrument classifications, which are slightly more scientific divisions of noise-producing bodies. We'll be referring to the Sachs-Hornbostel classification system, which includes aerophones, chordophones, idiophones, membranophones, and electrophones. Instrument classifications identify the means by which instruments are producing sound waves. So what sort of vibration is happening to make the air around it vibrate? So idiophones produce sound primarily by the vibration of the body of the instrument itself, oftentimes when it's struck, but it can also be bowed or produce sound in other ways. Because of this, we often find idiophones in the percussion section. Idiophones typically appearing in the contemporary European concert orchestra can include some pitched percussion instruments like xylophone, marimba, vibraphone, glockenspiel, and orchestral chimes, and some non-pitched percussion instruments like cowbell, temple blocks, wood blocks, liro, clave, cymbals, gongs, mark tree, rainstick, triangle, and slapstick, and many other percussion instruments. There are plenty of idiophones that don't appear in the contemporary European concert orchestra, such as the singing bowl, jaw harp, or glass harmonica, but these have also appeared in some pieces by composers. They're just not a standard member of the European orchestra. Membranophones are also frequently found in the percussion section. They produce sound primarily by the vibration of a membrane or skin stretched across the instrument. Membranophones typically appearing in the contemporary European concert orchestra include instruments that are pitched, like timpani and rototoms, and some non-pitched percussion instruments, like snare drum, toms, field drum, tambourine, bongos, congas, and bass drum. Membranophones not typically appearing in the contemporary European concert orchestra include the bodhran, the djembe, talking drums, cuica, and timbales. Apparently I was very excited about the djembe and included that twice. Chordophones produce sound by the vibration of a string or multiple strings, whether plucked, bowed, or beaten. Chordophones typically appearing in the European concert orchestra include instruments in the string sections, like the violin, viola, violoncello, typically just referred to as cello, and the double bass. Some keyboard instruments too, like the piano, harp, and harpsichord, and sometimes we'll see the mandolin and guitar appearing in the orchestra. Chordophones not typically appearing in the European concert orchestra include some of the following: banjo, zither, lute, oud, pipa, rebab, and sitar. Aerophones produce sound by the vibration of a column of air without using strings or membranes and without the body of the instrument itself adding greatly to the sound. Because of this, typically these are going to be referred to as wind instruments and usually are woodwinds and are brass instruments in the orchestra, though some others do appear. Aerophones typically appearing in the contemporary European concert orchestra include instruments like, in the woodwind section, flutes, clarinets, oboes, English horn, bassoon, and saxophones, and instruments in the brass section, like trumpets, French horn, trombones, euphoniums, and tubas. And if there's a pipe organ that's going to be included, that's going to be an aerophone as well. Aerophones not typically appearing in the contemporary European concert orchestra include the heckelphone, the serpent, which are older instruments, bagpipes, harmonica, melodica, accordion, sirens, shofar, cornet, and sackbut. All of these are wonderful instruments, they're just not typically part of the contemporary European concert orchestra. And electrophones are instruments which in some way rely upon electricity in order to produce sound. Electrophones have only recently been included with the European Concert Orchestra, and now only occasionally. Some examples of electrophones include synthesizers, theremins, and amplified instruments like the electric guitar. So let's now move to instrument families, because that's how we'll be dividing some of these presentations up. So these are grouped by orchestral usage, and in some cases, their mode of construction. Also, in some cases, all instruments in an instrument family will share the same Sachs-Horn-Bostel classification, but sometimes they won't, for instance, the percussion section. Our study of orchestration will center around the interactions of these instrument families, but it's helpful to understand how they're actually producing sound, which is why we went over the Sachs-Horn-Bostel classification first. The instrument families of the European Concert Orchestra typically include, in score order, woodwinds, brass, percussion, piano, harp, and auxiliary instruments, and strings. When I say score order, I'm referring to when a conductor is looking at the score, the order that the instruments are actually appearing in. We'll begin with the woodwinds then. These add considerable color to the European Concert Orchestra and typically include, in score order, flutes, sometimes including piccolo and alto flute, oboe, and sometimes English horn, clarinets in varying keys, and sometimes the bass clarinet, and the bassoon, and sometimes the contrabassoon. Less common in the European Concert Orchestra, but very common in wind ensemble orchestration, are saxophones. And though more saxophones than these four exist, most common are the soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone saxophones. Saxophones are a hybrid instrument combining qualities of the woodwind and the brass families. The flutes, piccolos, and alto flutes are known as edge-blown aerophones. Oboes, clarinets, bassoons, and saxophones are reed-blown aerophones. So these will have slightly different colors because they're producing sound in slightly different ways, but they will often blend together and be used together because they're all aerophones. The brass family layers even more color and panache to the European Concert Orchestra. In score order, we see the French horn, sometimes just horn, which has historically provided a link between the woodwind and the brass sections. Trumpets in various keys. Trombones, typically tenor, but often bass trombone as well, and tuba. Many other brass instruments exist, including the euphonium, flugelhorn, and Wagner tuba. The ones listed above appear most frequently in the common practice era. All of these brass instruments are aerophones. The percussion family covers a wide range of ground and comprises both pitched and non-pitched percussion. That is, percussion instruments that actually produce a pitch that someone could tune to. They produce a regular set of waves, and non-pitched percussion, which produce noisy, irregular waves. Our pitched percussion includes, but isn't limited to, timpani, rototoms, and various keyboard percussion, like xylophone, glockenspiel, marimba, and vibraphone, as well as orchestral chimes. And non-pitched percussion, including, but definitely not limited to, this whole variety of instruments here. Snare drum, bass drum, conga, bongos, concert toms, woodblock, temple blocks, drum kit, slapstick, whirro, vibraslap, break drums, triangles, cymbals, gongs, marktree, tam-tam, and more. If you can hit it or bow it, it has probably been used in a percussion section before. The percussion section is often also responsible for auxiliary instruments, like the use of the siren sometimes, as well as thunder sheets. Most instruments in the percussion section are going to be idiophones or membranophones. And there are also auxiliary instruments. Additionally, keyboard instruments and a wide array of other instruments can be added to the orchestral setup. These often include piano, harp, harpsichord, organ, synthesizer, as well as not listed here, the orchestral celeste. Piano, harp, and harpsichord are chordophones. The organ is an aerophone. The synthesizer is an electrophone, and the celeste, not listed here, is an idiophone. The string family makes up the core of the European Concert Orchestra. The typical array of string instruments that we see in the orchestra includes violins, typically divided into two sections, violins 1 and 2. Almost, I would say 99.9% of the orchestral scores that you'll look at have at least these two divisions of violins 1 and 2. So assume that that's going to be standard. Violas, violoncellos, typically referred to, as I mentioned, just as cellos. And double basses, sometimes referred to just as basses or contrabasses. If you're writing for chorus, you'll probably want to refer to them as double basses or contrabasses to make sure there's no confusion with the choral basses. All of these instruments are bowed chordophones. They may, of course, also be plucked, but we'll be talking about that when we discuss string writing coming up. Occasionally, guitars and mandolins also appear in the orchestra, but they will not be the focus of our study when we begin looking at the string family very shortly.